It's just there's nothing that a fundamentalist Christian and a fundamentalist Muslim can say to one another to put their beliefs on the table for revision. I mean, this is what dogmatism is. It is a willingness to believe things for bad reasons and an unwillingness to have your rather tenuous reasons challenged. I mean, you're saying, I believe this no matter what you or anyone else says. So it's the antithesis of conversation. It really is a conversation stopper, and so that's why I paint a very stark difference between faith and reason. I mean, reason, if you're reasonable, if you're interested in how the world works and what is true altogether, you are open. You're by definition open to further conversation, to more argument, to more evidence, and you're in fact interested to find out if you're mistaken about it. Grant the possibility that there is a creator God who's omniscient, who occasionally authors books. And he's going to give us a book, the most useful book. He's a loving God. He's a compassionate God. And he's going to give us a guide to life. He's got a scribe. The scribe's going to write it down. What's going to be in that book? I mean, just think of how good a book would be if it were authored by an omniscient deity. I mean, there is not a single line in the Bible or the Quran that could not have been authored by a first century person. I mean, there's not one reference to anything. There are pages and pages about how to sacrifice animals and keep slaves and who to kill and why. There's nothing about electricity. There's nothing about DNA. There's nothing about infectious disease, the principles of infectious disease. There's nothing particularly useful, and there's a lot of Iron Age barbarism in there and superstition. This is not a candidate book. I mean, I can go into to any Barnes and Noble blindfolded and pull a book off a shelf which is going to have more relevance, more wisdom for the 21st century than the Bible or the Quran. I mean, it's really not an exaggeration. Every one of our specific sciences has superseded and surpassed the wisdom of Scripture. From cosmology to psychology to economics, we know more about ourselves than anyone writing the Bible or the Quran did. And that is a distinctly inconvenient fact for anyone wanting to believe that this book was dictated by the creator of the universe.
We have joined the 99.9% of every other species that has ever been in existence on this tiny planet and become extinct. That close. What are we flattering ourselves about? What is so great about our anthropic principle that we should attribute this to a design or a designer? Some design, huh? And some designer too. Who but a serf wants it to be true? Who but someone who doesn't like to do their own thinking wants or needs this to be true in the face of all, not just some, but all of the available evidence before us? I've put it like this. It's the only hypothesis of my own that I've ever come up with. It's a version of, on this point anyway, it's a version of Joseph Schumpeter's hypothesis about creative destruction as the energy of capitalism. In order to believe not in a deistic God, in other words, a creator, a first cause, an imponderable starter, which of course only leads you to an infinite regression, because how could there be a starter who wasn't himself started or herself begun? Who created the God? Who made the creator? Who invented the inventor? Who designed the designer? Any fool can see the fallacy peering right over the shoulder of this hypothesis. But suppose that's not just a theistic question, but a deistic question, but a theistic one. A God who answers prayers, a God who intervenes, a God who didn't just start this, but cares how it winds up, who cares what you do to your private parts or to those of your children and insists on their being mutilated, who knows what you should eat and what day of the week, who knows with which gender you may or may not recreate yourself or be recreational with, and so forth. The deist has all their work still ahead of them to prove that there is such a being. Here's what you'd have to believe to be a theist. I've already shown the absurdity of deism, I hope. To be a theist, you'd have to believe this. How long do you think, ladies and gentlemen, I have 3 minutes, shan't, I hope, need them all. how long do you think the human species, as a distinct Homo sapiens, has been on the planet? Anyone want to shout a guess? Okay. Well, Richard Dawkins thinks 250,000 years, 250,000. That's considered to be on the high end. Francis Collins, who's become a friend of mine, a very, very devout Christian, who, as you will know, sequenced the Human Genome Project and did the final report on the full-out discovery of that unravelment, which showed us our kinship with other creatures and indeed with other non-creatures, other forms of vegetation and junk that's in our, undoubtedly proves us to be part of the creational soup. He thinks minimum 100,000. He's not quite sure if it's 250,000. All right, I only need 100,000. 100,000 years since we dared to became separate from the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals as our own species, Homo sapiens. Here's what you have to believe to be a theist. For 100,000 years, humanity is born. Perhaps 25% of it dies in childbirth or very shortly afterwards. Life expectancy, I don't know, 25 for a very long time. Infant mortality, extraordinary, after childbirth deaths, I mean. Killed by microorganisms we didn't know existed, by earthquakes that we thought were portents, by storms that we didn't know came from our climate system, by other events that arise from being born onto a cooling planet with deep cracks in its crust, faults in its crust. Then man-made things, turf wars, fights over women, fights over territory, over food, and so on. Very, very slow, gradual, exponential upward progress, we might like to think. Pretty slow, but at least we can claim, out of our own self-respect, man-made. And for the first 96,000 years of this experience, heaven watches with folded arms. Us go through this with indifference, without pity. And then around 4,000 years ago decides, gee, it's time to intervene. And the best way of doing that would probably be in Bronze Age Middle East, making appearances to stupefied illiterate peasants, which could later be passed on. The news would get to China after about 1,000 years of that.
2 minutes.
That's what you have to believe. Aren't you glad you can't be made to believe that? Aren't you glad?
Most atheistic societies on the planet, societies like Norway and Denmark and Iceland and Sweden, these are the healthiest places to live by really every relevant factor. Violent crime, gender equality, educational attainment, per capita income, infant mortality. American teens are 70 times more likely to have gonorrhea than their French counterparts living in a comparatively atheistic France. So this idea that somehow high levels of religious literalism guarantee a kind of public morality and societal health appears to be an absolute... One problem is that we have many holy books authored by the creator of the universe, and they're in conflict. You know, they're not... The New Testament makes it perfectly clear that Jesus is the Son of God, really the Son of God, and you have to believe this, otherwise you're going to spend eternity in hell. The Quran says twice that Jesus was not the Son of God, and anyone who believes he's the Son of God will spend eternity in hell. I mean, this offers as much room for compromise as a coin toss. So let's say we just knew that one of those claims was right. You know, we have we've eliminated all the other possibilities. We're living in this challenging universe where God has given us a highly imperfect book and asked us to grapple with it. But now we have the biblical claim, the New Testament claim to the divinity of Jesus, and the necessity of believing in it, and the Quranic claim that belief in Jesus' divinity leads to damnation. Now, which is more likely, that one of those is right and the other is wrong, or that we have these competing tribes who are toiling in the context of just abysmal ignorance about the world and the birth of the cosmos and the destiny of any individual soul after death. I would put my lot in with a wider view of the circumstance. But even if we granted your premise that no, there's a good reason to believe that one of these books is perfect, we're still with a coin toss situation. We don't know whether to be a Christian or a Muslim. And we're noticing that people are choosing basically on the basis of accidents of birth. I mean, you're just accidentally born in Afghanistan, and then you choose to be a Muslim. And likewise with Christianity elsewhere, it's a very strange sort of loving God who would have created this circumstance. That by mere accident of birth, you are raised to believe that a certain book was and let's say rightly raised to believe that this book was, the perfect book. But if you happen to be born in China, you go for centuries without hearing about this. It's a strange, for I think obvious reasons, a totally provincial and implausible scenario, and yet it's the scenario that most people believe in the 21st century.
As we've begun to see, one of the problems with arguing in defense of God is that the evidence in your favor is either terrible or non-existent. What we've heard from the other side and from the middle is that science is so complicated and counterintuitive and obviously incomplete that this leaves room for the God of Abraham. Okay, that's basically the argument. That the scientists don't understand everything. We don't understand how the first complex molecules self-assembled. Indeed, we don't. Scientists are the first to admit when they don't know. So the arrogance is very much on the side of those who would put their Iron Age faiths in the place of genuine scientific ignorance. Another problem with religious moderation is it's actually intellectually bankrupt. When just consider for a moment this notion that you should respect other people's beliefs. Where else in our discourse do we encounter this? I mean, when was the last time anyone in this room was admonished to respect another person's beliefs about history or biology or physics? We do not respect people's beliefs. We evaluate their reasons. If my reasons are good enough for believing what I believe, you will helplessly believe what I believe. I will give you my reasons, and reasons are contagious. That is what it is to be a rational human being. Respecting another person's beliefs never enters into it. Just appreciate for a moment how easy this is to see when we just change the subject from God to some mundane, grandiose claim. This is actually an example from my book. If I told you that I believe that there was a diamond buried in my backyard that's the size of a refrigerator, it might occur to you to ask me why. If in response I gave the kinds of answers you hear from religious moderates, the answers that describe the good effects of this, of believing as I do. So I said things like, well, this belief actually gives my life a lot of meaning. Or, I wouldn't want to live in a universe where there wasn't a diamond buried in my backyard that's the size of a refrigerator. I mean, it's pretty clear that responses of this sort are deeply inadequate. They're worse than that. They are the responses of a lunatic or an idiot. I mean, by responding in that way, I would have disqualified myself for any position of responsibility in a first world society. Except you change the subject to religion, to the moral demands of an invisible superintelligence, to what happens after death, and all bets are off. Then you can say anything you want.